My name is Bill Resh. I'll get into introductions in a second. You've come to a discussion on the Joe Biden presidency in terms of its first 100 days, but putting it into the context of a phenomenon that is quite peculiar to American government compared to the rest of the world, but something that is, I would say, woven into our constitutional structure. Our new president, like his predecessors before him, has inherited probably the world's, or one of the world's largest and probably its most complex institution. The executive branch is a panoply of agencies, sub-agencies, departments, bureaus, government corporations, banks, and committees, and lots of other things. And I say institution because it's very much a mosaic of rules and norms that are reflective of public values that are decided, frankly, without the president's consent. Rather, in our separation of power system, the legislature creates and, for all intents and purposes, owns the organization that the president is elected to lead. Moreover, he, and one day she, must lead this institution according to the strictures of the law that are set by the legislature, but then arbitrated by the judicial branch. So unlike most executive positions, the president and his administration decide neither the purpose of these organizations, and they are severely limited as to what directions those organizations might take in achieving those purposes. That being said, presidents do all they can to direct policy in the way they prefer. Despite these limitations, and presidents have several tools at their disposal, including centralized regulatory policymaking within the White House, reorganizing agencies and personnel, how they see fit within agencies, and perhaps most importantly, and what will be the subject of today's conversation, appointing people to lead those various agencies who, for the most part, are presumably loyal to the president, but maybe even more importantly, loyal to the policy prerogatives that the administration has. And the last of these areas, this subject of appointment, is what brings our panel together today. There are over 4,000 senior government officials that presidents appoint. Approximately 1/4 of those at the very highest ranks of these organizations also require what is known as Senate advice and consent. The succession of cabinet secretaries, deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, inspectors general, so on and so forth. All these appointees with these important titles are done through presidential nomination, and then the Senate will advise and consent and confirm, or potentially confirm, these president's nominations. But this is a costly endeavor, and costly in terms of resources, costly in terms of time. And frankly, that is by constitutional design. Senate confirmation nests the appointment of these positions in this kind of tangle of institutional bargaining and overlapping prerogatives. And a byproduct of this arrangement is a pattern of vacant appointee positions. And I say that's peculiar to American government, one, because we have so many appointees at the top of these organizations, but the fact that many of these positions remain vacant over time is especially peculiar, or especially, kind of singular to the American government in general. Back in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, you had an average over the first 2 years of his administration of about 113 days of vacancy across positions, across executive positions. That average number has basically tripled up through the Donald Trump administration. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean first by vacancy? It's not as if these organizations aren't running. It's not as if there aren't, at least nominal leaders in place. But also, what are the implications that these vacancies have to our polity? If the president is nominating people but can't get those nominees in place, or if the president just isn't nominating people and relying on sub-delegation to others within the organization, what does this mean? Does it mean that they can exploit the confirmation process and these long periods of vacancies to their own advantage? What impact does this have on the integrity of our civil service? How can organizations do long-term planning in the face of leadership vacancies? In short, how do we govern legitimately in the face of this increasing phenomenon? Is it reflective of our polarized environment and partisanship and whatnot? So to address these questions and more, I have invited two of the premier experts on this subject to join me today in a conversation about the state of presidential appointments, the state of subsequent vacancies that might happen, the health of our civil service, and how they expect things to unfold during the Biden presidency. And also, finally, if there's any potential for reform on this issue. It might sound like a lot, and it is, but we hope to keep the conversation light and informative. But we'd like to also address some questions from the audience at the end. So with that, I ask that you please hold your questions until the end using the Q&A function. I'll then convey them to our panelists as time permits. And thank you all for joining us for today's conversation. So our guests today are Professor Anne Joseph O'Connell and Dr. Christina Kinane. Dr. Kinane is an assistant professor of political science at Yale University and a research fellow at the Institution of Social and Policy Studies. Broadly, she studies the role of legislatures, executives, and the bureaucracy in policymaking, but in particular, her current research examines how presidents strategically use vacancies and top appointments to promote their policy priorities within the framework of interbranch bargaining. Her dissertation, Control Without Confirmation, was awarded the 2020 George C. Edwards III Award for Best Dissertation in Executive Politics by the American Political Science Association. And she continues apace with other work on that topic and also on other topics as well. Dr. Joseph O'Connell is an appointed senior fellow of the Administrative Conference of the United States. She was previously a volunteer for Joe Biden for President's Policy Team, but her day job is as the Delbert H. Sweet Professor of Law at Stanford University. She is an elected fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Public Administration, and an elected member of the American Law Institute. Professor O'Connell has written on a number of topics, including agency rulemaking, the selection of agency leaders, and bureaucratic organization or reorganization. And fortunate for us, she's also currently working on a book titled Stand-ins that explores the dynamics of temporary leadership in government, but also compared to private sector and even religious organizations. My name is Bill Resh. I'm an associate professor here at the Price School of Public Policy, and I hold the C.C. Crawford Professorship in Management and Leadership. I too have written extensively on the topic of presidential appointments and leadership. But most of my focus has been on what happens inside organizations when appointed leaders and the career civil service kind of interface. I have also, however, written on the appointment process and how key Senate figures might seek to lengthen appointments to favor themselves. I could think of no area in American politics and policy that is more obviously overlapping the fields of political science, administrative law, constitutional law, and public management more than presidential appointments. So I'm quite pleased to be able to have our two guests here to talk about the subject. And I would like to start, if I could, by asking Anne to provide us some background on the importance of presidential appointees generally, namely Senate-confirmed appointments, but really the increasing frequency of vacancies in these positions. And in 1998, the US Congress passed the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, and that was intended to kind of incentivize Congress to move forward and also to get presidents to nominate, but also to ensure that there was adequate leadership in place when a vacancy occurred. So to start, Anne, I'd like to ask you to provide us with that background on the FVRA and provide a little bit of assessment on its implementation. And yeah, so thank you very much, Dr. O'Connell. The floor is yours.
Before I get into some of the basic contours of the Federal Vacancies Act of 1998. I just want to add to Bill's rich description and his own work on vacancies, one statistic that appeared in a recent draft paper by Dave Lewis and Nick Bednar, and it's the following. So they looked at vacant Senate-confirmed positions in the last 3 completed administrations. And they found that on average, in the first 2 years of those 3 administrations, that about 30% of those vacant positions never received a single nomination, right? So close to a third of Senate confirmed positions never received a single nomination in the first 2 years of the last 3 presidencies. So there are lots of vacancies. And so what happens? Well, in many cases, you can have acting officials taking up the charge of those positions. So we've had Vacancies Acts since the start of the country. The first Vacancies Act was in 1792. We've had various versions over the years. After some tension between congressional Republicans and President Bill Clinton, there was a bipartisan amended version in 1998. And what does it do? Well, it allows for acting officials in a large group of agencies. So all the cabinet departments, all the single-headed agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, but it largely doesn't cover any agency that ends in the word commission or board. So the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board has no actings and a backlog of over 3,000 cases right now. There are a couple positions in these independent regulatory commissions that are covered, general counsel positions, but largely we're talking about having acting officials under the Vacancies Act in cabinet departments and executive agencies. And what does the Act allow? Well, the Act allows acting officials if they fall into one of 3 categories. The first category is that the first assistant by default is the acting. No presidential action required. So if there is a deputy secretary who's confirmed and there's a vacant cabinet secretary position, that deputy secretary is the acting cabinet secretary. Now, the Vacancies Act allows the president and the president alone to choose someone from 2 other categories if he prefers. So what are those 2 categories? Well, if someone is Senate confirmed somewhere in the executive branch, that person can be an acting. So when Shulkin was forced out of the Veterans Administration, Robert Wilkie comes in as a Senate confirmed person from the Defense Department to be acting VA secretary. In the Trump administration. The other category presidents can draw on is they can draw on senior agency workers in that specific agency. So someone who served at least 90 days in the year preceding the vacancy and is paid at least a GS 15 or higher. And we saw this after President Trump pushed out Jeff Sessions as Attorney General of the Justice Department. Instead of having the Deputy Attorney General, who is the default to be the acting AG, Rosenstein, instead, President Trump turned to the Vacancies Act and put Matthew Whitaker, who had been Chief of Staff to Jeff Sessions, in as acting Attorney General. Now, there are some legal issues potentially surrounding that, but that's sort of how the Vacancies Act works. And these acting officials under the Vacancies Act at least have the same formal power as someone who's confirmed to the role. Now, these actings, they get 210 days to serve unless it's the first year of an administration, and they get 300 days. Turns out if there are pending nominations, can be extended considerably. You can serve for 300 days in the first year, nomination pending, you serve during the nomination. That the nomination fails, gets returned, you get an additional 210 days. Second nomination goes in, you can serve as an acting through that entire second nomination. If that second nomination also fails, say is returned, you get a final 210 days. And the idea is that you can't use the acting title if the time limit has expired. And so there were some issues. Usually in mid-November, a bunch of reporters are looking at agency websites trying to figure out who's still improperly using the acting title. So in November of 2021, I expect we're going to see the same sort of thing happening as we saw in the Trump administration. As I said, the nominations extend the time limits for actings. There are some twists about being the nominee and an acting, right? There are limitations on allowing an acting official to also be the formal nominee. There are some restrictions on that, and can talk more about that. Now, Bill, do you want me now just to raise very quickly some of the legal issues that are on board, or should I wait for that?
No, you're welcome to.
Okay, so I'm both a political scientist and a lawyer. And so the Vacancies Act of 1998 presents a range of legal issues. It kept me busy for several years on the variety of legal issues. You can take those legal issues and you can put them into two boxes. One box, constitutional issues, other box, statutory issues. So let me just flag very quickly the main ones in each box. So on the constitutional side, the main issue is, can you have an acting cabinet secretary who has never been confirmed to a specific position, right? Because under the Appointments Clause of the United States Constitution, we have principal offices and inferior offices. And a principal office under the Constitution has to be filled by someone who is appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. And principal offices at the least include cabinet secretaries, right? Because the cabinet secretaries are directed and supervised only by the president. There's no kind of intermediate person, which could make them inferior. So what happens when Matthew Whitaker becomes acting attorney general in 2018? He's been serving as chief of staff to Jeff Sessions, which is not a Senate confirmed position. And all of a sudden, he has all the formal authority of the attorney general in his acting capacity. And the question is that constitutional? And it's not just a Matthew Whitaker issue. So when President Biden took office on January 20th, he relied on two holdover Senate confirmed officials at the Defense Department and the Homeland Security Department. But his other 13 acting secretaries had not been confirmed to any position. And President Biden, unlike any recent president, had no newly confirmed cabinet secretaries on his first day of office, right? So are those acting secretaries? Now we don't have any, right? Because President Biden actually the first in kind of recent modern administrations to have a full cabinet of all his initial nominees, not a single failed nominee. But there is a question, are acting cabinet secretaries who have not been confirmed to any other position, are they constitutionally serving? I think they are. Other people think they're not. There was a bunch of litigation about Matthew Whitaker. All of the courts to decide the Matthew Whitaker issue said that Whitaker was properly serving under the Constitution, but he had only been serving a little bit of time, and that might be a key factor in analyzing it. So there are a bunch of statutory issues. I'll just flag very quickly. A first issue is what happens when there's a specific agency statute that talks about interim service. How does that specific agency statute interact with the Vacancies Act? Is the specific statute exclusive? Can the president still turn to the Vacancies Act? Bunch of controversy here in the Trump administration. Most notably at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB had a specific agency statute that said that the deputy director shall be the acting director. President Trump did not want Leandra English, who was the deputy director, named kind of as Richard Cordray was on his way out to be the acting director. So he turned to the Vacancies Act, turned to the category of someone who was Senate confirmed to some other position. That was Mick Mulvaney at OMB, and said under the Vacancies Act, Mulvaney could be the acting director. The district court agreed with the Trump administration. The case actually was dismissed before the DC Circuit ruled on it. But there's a lot of controversy here, a lot of people on both sides about the CFPB. This issue also came up about the Department of Justice and Matthew Whitaker because there was a Department of Justice Attorney General Succession Act. Again, the court sided there with the Trump administration, but a lot of arguments on the other side. A second statutory issue is, does the Vacancies Act apply when the president creates the vacancy by firing? So when David Shulkin was pushed out at the Veterans Administration, there was litigation over whether Wilkie could be the acting secretary of the VA. And so I think you can see the language from the Vacancies Act on the slide. I think firing comes within otherwise unable to perform the functions and duties of the office, but others disagree on that. So that's another statutory issue. And then finally, the other ones involve, can you name a first assistant after the vacancy? And is that allowed? And this got a little more complicated when Ken Cuccinelli was put in as a first assistant at U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services. But not only was he put in after the vacancy, they also created a new first assistant position after the vacancy. And the District of DC definitely didn't decide the question about whether you can name a first assistant after the vacancy, but said that this new position was not allowed. And then finally, there's a case right now pending at the Supreme Court. There were oral arguments in December. Is in the Federal Housing Finance Agency, there are removal restrictions on the director, and that agency is covered by the Vacancies Act. But the challenged actions in that case were actually done by an acting director and not a confirmed director. So the question is, do the removal restrictions for the Federal Housing Finance Agency, do they apply to acting leaders? And the Fifth Circuit said they did. And so the Supreme Court is hearing a case that involves that issue and sort of expecting a decision sort of any day now. And then the final thing I'll say about legal issues is, even if you can't use the acting title under the Vacancies Act, you can, it seems, by pretty much all courts except one district court in Montana, you can delegate all of the non-exclusive functions of that vacant position downward. So even if the time limits have run out, you can use delegation of all the vacant jobs duties, and then the person is kind of carrying out the job just with a longer title. Instead of being the acting director, you are the senior official performing the functions of such and such position. So there's a wide variety of complexity, which at least keeps my life interesting.
Thank you so much. So that actually is a perfect segue in many respects, because there are many normative implications to that, right? Especially the last slide on the concept of subdelegation. Now, if you think about what is the purpose of Senate confirmed appointments to begin with, it is to essentially ensure co-ownership of the branches, or between the branches of these agencies, that the leadership that a president puts into place in these legislatively created organizations, that it jives with the preferences of the Senate, right? But if these vacancies can persist as they have, and have increased rather exponentially over the last few presidencies, and there's this opportunity, whether informally or by law formally, allowing the president or the agency to subdelegate responsibilities to people who are not confirmed by the Senate, right? So now, first, the normative implications are, okay, where's the democratic connection here to, in terms of running the administrative state? We're losing a substantial portion of that democratic legitimacy if the Senate does not have the ability to really decide or help decide who's going to be in position in their agency. But more from a political economy perspective, and this is why I'd like to turn to Christina now, it presents opportunities, obviously, for a president to potentially shirk their responsibility, their legislatively delegated responsibility to faithfully execute the law, right? Because they have, they've been able to avoid the kind of, let's say, upfront ex ante types of screening selection, right? So the Senate, essentially by consent and advise and consent, they are essentially screening what leadership is appropriate for the agency. And if you're able to avoid that ex ante kind of screening oversight, and the responsibilities are delegated down to, potentially several different parts of the organization, several different actors in the organization, the ex post oversight is also complicated by the situation, right? And so I'd like to talk to Christina, given her expertise and her voluminous work on the topic, what she sees as some of the issues that have arisen as a function of the FVRA, the Federal Vacancy Reform Act, and how presidents have potentially exploited these rules to their advantage in seeing through their policy preferences. So with that, Christina, if you don't mind taking the floor, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, I did not prepare slides, Anne.
Neither did I, Christina. Don't
You
worry.
had this whole slide deck yesterday. You've done your slides.
Well, that was a part of the thought process. Is I didn't, in case there were people watching, I didn't want to repeat and potentially bore on a subject that I, of course, and you would not find boring in 100 years. But I think to your question, Bill, about the normative implications of this, particularly for oversight, I think that there are huge implications. And really, basically, it boils down, in my view, is to what are the intentions of the Senate, of really Congress, in delegating the power that they do to the positions that are determined to be PAS positions, to be positions that require Senate confirmation. Are they intending in that, act of delegation to offer to these unelected agents a considerable amount of policymaking, decision-making, and really the core ability to impact how the federal government is ultimately going to be implementing the laws that Congress passes? Because one of the things that kind of wrapped up in this whole conversation is the fact that ultimately Congress can pass as many laws as they want. They are not the ones implementing the law. And in fact, over the years, there's lots of research that looks at just how much discretion is afforded to members of the bureaucracy in hopes of eliciting more expertise. You wouldn't necessarily want some, member of the House of Representatives determining exactly the level of pollutants allowed in exhaust from a car. These are things you want to delegate to people who perhaps have a little bit more background, foundation, maybe just underhand knowledge of what actually those things are. These kinds of delegation have increasingly become more broad, increasingly become more vague as the issues that they're addressing become more complex. And in a hope of requiring these leaders, these individuals who determine the direction of these large agencies, that determine the tone, the priorities, the way in which these laws passed by Congress are implemented, those individuals are supposed to be approved by Congress. They have been delegated that power under the condition that they would have Senate confirmation. And what the Vacancies Act has offered the president to do is to pursue priorities for various government actions that they deem to be necessary, to be, high on their list of achievable goals, outside of this formal confirmation and advice and consent prerogative that the Senate has. And in doing so, there are two kind of opportunities that kind of fall through the cracks. One is the opportunity to bring the nominee forward and lay out for the public the background of that nominee, to require that nominee, however problematic it may be, thousands of pages to turn in for financial disclosures and various background checks on these individuals. There's a lot of talk and research and folks on both sides as to whether or not that's necessary, whether or not that is overly burdensome on the nominees themselves, that if perhaps those types of inundations of paperwork weren't required, perhaps the Senate confirmation process would go a little bit quicker. But nonetheless, it requires those individuals who would then have the authority and the power to make really potentially impactful decisions on everyday Americans to sit before a committee of senators who have been elected by voters and say, are you qualified for this job? Separate from that, Are there reasons why you maybe shouldn't be in this position? Perhaps you have once sued the agency that you are now nominated to run to dismantle it. Or perhaps you have pursued a variety of career decisions that may be a little bit antithetical to the mission of the agency. Is that necessarily bad or good? That is for the senators of that committee to determine, and for them, beholden to their constituencies, to decide on whether or not it's worth putting the stamp of the Senate's approval. And oftentimes we've seen with controversial nominees that end up having to have a tiebreaker a vote from a vice president on the Senate floor, that these are really important issues that voters care about. And sidestepping that process means that for however long they're in the position, those individuals have not undergone that scrutiny. And so normatively, this is a bit problematic, I would say. Now to the question of, oh, Bill, you were—
No, please continue. No,
Again,
please continue.
Don't have slides to power through, but I did jot down some thoughts, basically thinking through, what impact this kind of end round around the Senate consent might have on the relationship between Congress and the president. And I think perhaps the largest impact that it has is shining a really bright light on the fact that Congress is really constrained in its ability to compel the president to do anything, much less to submit a nominee for the Senate's consent. And it's really not even about who is submitted, which of course is the subject of a whole host of political science research. Really important and great work has been done by Anne, by you, Bill, by lots of people who I'm sure in the audience, about who that nominee is, why they are chosen. But ultimately, what the more a brighter light shines on the fact that the president need not submit one in the first place. And because the Senate cannot compel, we then run into these issues of what can the Senate do, what can Congress do, and really what Trump has kind of offered is with the FVRA and with the extended time limits that Anne so very clearly and nicely laid out, these actings can serve for an incredible amount of time in a 4-year period, the minimum of 720 days if you back to back those second nominations. And if you stagger them ever just so that you turn one in right at the 210-day mark and it sits there until it's returned at the next recess, which by the way also isn't happening all that often because, or at least it didn't, because they didn't want recess appointments. So then we have this toggling between returning these nominations and having that interim allowed to stay for a considerable amount of time of 4 years. And a lot can be done. A lot of really impactful decisions can be done. And then really what Congress has available to them is oversight after the fact. And so that's what I think it really shines a light on for that relationship. But anyhow.
Well, thank you, Christina. That was very enlightening. You're actually bringing me to an important, or what I think is an important question, is, we're back to this question of, the normative implications of democratic oversight. You said, Congress is severely limited in its ability to oversee the executive. But the fact is, from work that's been done by Kevin Kozar, Tim Lapira, people like this, they've shown that this capacity is diminished even more, right? And by their own hand, right? So less and less of their staff is dedicated towards policy issues. More and more is dedicated to constituent outreach back home and basically promoting the name of the member of Congress, right? So what are we left with in terms of the ability of Congress to see what's happening during these vacancies, right? It seems that we've had, you mentioned, why do we have professionals in place to begin with, right? We want to give them discretion, right? And you want to know that however parts per million of a given chemical is in your waterway is decided by an expert and not by, somebody in the house, right? But so then that brings me to the question of, well, if the actings are career professionals that who are experts in these particular domains, is it a bad thing to have, a vacancy within an appointed position? Because let's think of the kind of long-term impacts of a vacancy. Or how about the long-term, I'm going to reverse it. How about the long-term impacts of a short-term appointee? A short-term appointee, they're coming into office, and according to Matt Dahl and Patrick Roberts and others who have studied it, the tenure of these appointees averages about 2 years at best, right? I mean, that's the average, but you could get a lot of appointees who are there for far shorter periods of time, right? Nonetheless, any of these appointees, if they're rational at all, are looking at this short window and saying, okay, I've got priorities and I need to get things done, right? And one of the things that probably isn't being addressed very well is long-term planning for the agency. How can the agency persist and continue to perform over time, right? Or even knowing, those what delegated responsibilities they have outside of where their priorities are, right? And so I'm wondering, what your thoughts are in terms of why a president would choose a vacancy, not to shirk necessarily legislative responsibility, but because, they have limited resources. Doesn't it make sense to not put a person in place and spend all this political capital on an appointment and so on and so forth? So, and I leave that question open to the both of you, because I'd like it from there maybe to lead to what kind of reform, if any, are we interested in here? And that's actually a question from one of our audience members, but I'll get to that in a second. First, I'd just like to focus on this concept of, do we care whether or not an appointment is placed?
Well, Anne, do you want to take a head start on that, or?
Sure. So, right, there are always trade-offs. I see that George Krause is on the webinar, right? So he and I have done some work, and mostly George on his own and with other co-authors has done work looking at kind of characteristics of appointees themselves and trade-offs between loyalty and competence. But you can have the same thing if you're comparing actings with appointees, right? So appointees bring more accountability through, as Christina described, this whole Senate process, even with its incredible paperwork requirements. But at least for some positions, the actings may bring more expertise. So I think it really depends on positions. In a piece that I recently wrote for Columbia Law Review entitled Actings, I look at sort of the normative advantages and disadvantages of actings. And for some positions, say U.S. attorneys, ambassadors, inspectors general, the actings tend to be drawn from the senior career ranks. So at least when it comes to expertise, right, for ambassadors, right, these are senior career foreign service officers. They're not the campaign bundlers, either for the Democrat or the Republican president. And so there, if you care most about expertise, you would be worried less about the fact that they haven't gone through Christina's advantages of all the accountability the confirmation brings. But our system, right, these people are also unelected. So like, how do you weigh accountability and expertise? The only other thing I'll add, and then I have a whole separate thing on reform, which we'll get to, is that sort of how effective is someone within the agency also depends in part on their status, right? So there's something about being confirmed. You have sort of more functional stature in the agency, right? Max Steyer, head of Partnership for Public Service, has likened acting officials to substitute teachers. So you might have the same formal authority, but you might not have the same functional authority, and the people below you may not work as hard for an acting because they think, oh, this person, direction may change with a confirmed person. The acting person may be more of a caretaker. So you also have to think about kind of effectiveness related to stature.
Christina, I'd like, please add on, and also, but more about what advantage to a president in terms of relying on these actings as opposed to.
So I think, and Anne is certainly, certainly heading right in the direction that I was going to talk to, and that is this difference between where you're drawing these actings from. You're drawing them from the career ranks. You're drawing them from, these political appointees who've been shuffled around. In my own work, I've also found I like Anne. I know Anne did a bunch of interviews that went into the actings piece that you did, and also the ACUS report I think that you did. I also did interviews, and what I found in some of my interviews, all of the same themes were there. That the confirmed offers the honorable title, right? The honorable so and so, as opposed to Mr. So and so acting such and such, or Miss so and so acting such and such, and it confers a bit of legitimacy, but only at the margins. That by and large, the individuals who are interacting with these actings on a day-to-day basis aren't necessarily recognizing that there is a difference between them being acting and the person being confirmed, mostly just because they're there to do a job. Ultimately, it kind of gets back to this part of that's baked into what I've argued is a really important part of what we need to pay attention to, and that is the position itself. What is the position supposed to do? What is the person, if there is a person, supposed to be doing within that seat that they're filling? But one of the things that I also found, and I think Anne found similarly, is that when you are a career person and you are filling a position on an acting capacity, the ones are a lot of times the kind of air around you is that you are more of this caretaker, that you're not engaged in this political active policymaking. That is very different from someone who's a political appointee who's brought in to be an acting. I found time and time again that if these individuals were political actings, that they recognized both that they had policy making expectations built into the role that they were playing in the agency, and that in those cases they would in fact be looking down the road, and they would be deemed, these individuals from the administration, from the president, tasked with long-term policymaking planning and directives. And so again, I think it's this toggling between what the president is looking to do and how that position advances the president's priorities specifically.
If I could just add in one quick thing, is I think the standard story, and this is Christina's amazing work, is right that it's in the president's interest sometimes to use interim authority. And I think one of the big explanations is that the interim is kind of closer to the president's ideal point, as opposed to someone who has to get through Senate confirmation. And I think that was sort of behind President Trump's often quoted statement about how he loved his actings because he had more power over his actings. But I think there's an additional thing that's Bridget Dooling had mentioned to me, which I think is really fascinating. And it's the idea that it might also be in the president's interest to use an acting because a nominee may be more controversial within the president's own party, right? So you might have a more liberal wing of the party and the more conservative wing of the party, and they disagree on who should be, for example, the comptroller of the currency is getting some press right now in the Biden administration, other positions. And so by not putting forward a nominee, by not taking a side, you kind of get yourself out of some of kind of your own internal party conflict.
Sorry, it's hard for me sometimes to unmute. Nonetheless, thank you, Anne, Christina. Again, the conversation just brings me to more questions, right? So we have this, strategic, calculation on behalf of the presidency in terms of vacancies, right? But I could also see the strategic calculation on behalf of members of the Senate, and which Gary, Matt, and Patrick, and I have written about. That I could see a preference to keep status quo orientation of an agency that might favor or might be ideologically, closer to a key Senate pivot. Right? That's I don't want to get into the jargon too much, but to key Senate members who might be interested in maintaining that status quo, particularly if they know that this vacancy leads to an acting that is of the career ranks, right? Because those career ranks, they stay, over time, and so they can build relationships with key Senate members, right?
Well, I do. If I could just, I would want to also, and maybe I should have checked. Is this where we're getting into the conversation part of it?
Yes, without question. Yeah.
So I mean, so one of the things that I've also found in my interviews with individuals is that is true, that careerists offer a potentially, more neutral stance in the sense that they're not the political point or politically chosen appointee, but that the longer they stay in that position, the more they are associated with that administration, and in fact, then choose to exit the civil service. So having long-standing acting careerists who have been, these influential, really long, lifetime civil servants, then lose them because they have occupied a political position for too long, that they've then become associated with that administration. That, I think, is perhaps an externality of all of this that not really Congress is thinking of, or maybe they are. I'm not sure.
Could I ask then? Is it a bad thing to have careerists, more aware and involved in political questions surrounding the agency? And the reason I ask this is in my own interviews of careerists, and this is not just those that are directly interacting with political appointees, but those that are below in the middle management ranks and have responsibilities to administer and to implement, right? That they are more fully informed of the direction of the agency, what their jobs entail, what is their charge, when they have more access to political information, and that many times the attitude of incoming political appointees is, okay, so we're going to respect the careers rank regardless if they respect them or not, right? We're gonna keep them to quote unquote administrative issues. We'll take care of the quote unquote political ones. But making this kind of false dichotomy between politics and administration, that administration doesn't have inherently, kind of political implications, right? And so I could see the other side of the coin, where we want careerists to have political information, because it trickles down through the ranks that they can more kind of robustly administer when they're not shielded or protected, so to speak, from political information, right? That being said, I don't want to lose this expertise per se, right? But do we really lose it? They might leave the career ranks, but are they done in that policy realm? Are they, I'm just wondering what the impact as you see it might be. It seems that you would see it as negative. Is that at least normative?
You're trying to jump in.
Why don't you answer, Christina? But then I have a thought on this.
I think to your point, honestly, what it boils down to for me, or at least my perspective, not for me personally, but my perspective, is that if Congress doesn't want these positions to have to Senate confirmation authority, then they can simply change it. They've done that. They've changed the authority of the positions so that they are not Senate confirmable. We had the movement of over 100 of these types of PIS positions out of the Senate confirmed part in 2011. And so these things can happen. But importantly, to your point about whether we lose the expertise, my question is less the expertise, but rather like the node in some really important network. The government is made up of millions of humans, but each bureau, each sub-agency, each division, if you've been working there for a long time, you know everyone, and you not only have an expertise in the policy, but you have an expertise in the humans that are also working with you. And so you might not exit the policy realm, you might become some really high paid consultant, But I think if what we're really concerned about is having good administration, having a good, stable government that's administering and implementing the laws that Congress passes in a way that benefits the American people, I don't think we want to lose those like long-standing careerists.
I so appreciate that point, Christina. So, Anne, please.
Interject?
Yes, of course.
So, because it ties really nicely. So I guess I'm less optimistic than Christina on Congress actually changing the status of these roles. So this is probably my most provocative thought about acting officials. So it's true in 2011 that about 160 Senate confirmed positions lost the Senate confirmation part. But since then, Congress has kind of added confirmation to a bunch of spots. And so the number really hasn't shifted much. And of course, it's not in Congress's political interests to get rid of confirmation. And so here's my provocative thought is that acting officials functionally give you what every good government commission has asked for, which is a real reduction in Senate confirmed positions, because that's what you're getting in actings. You're getting it functionally as opposed to formally. And I guess I don't see that as a bad thing. Right? Because I think that there should be far fewer Senate confirmed positions. And if we're getting it this way, we're getting it this way. I do think it does, speaking to Christina's example from the interviews of people kind of leaving after a long service, and the interviews that I and law students at Stanford, including some who were on the webinar did, is that actings who were drawn from the career ranks talked about the awkwardness of when a confirmed person came in. Like they were sort of seen like they had all this expertise and like it was kind of uncomfortable to be like at the top and then no longer at the top. But I think what this speaks to, and it was a theme you raised at the start, Bill, is we need to think about civil service reform as well, right? To think about engaging paths so that people don't want to become highly paid consultants or the graduates of the Price School of Public Policy go into government as opposed into government contracting. And some of that has to do with like getting into roles that have, quote, political/policy elements, even though they are in the civil service.
Wow, so many points covered there that I want to touch on like three of them, but I'm going to isolate it to one, and that's the point about So when an acting is a career official, in many respects, it's meeting that ideal of the previous Volcker commissions or whatever commission might be addressing civil service reform, and the recommendations have by and large been limit the number of appointments. The problem, I think, however, and as I'm sure both of you recognize, is that usually it's actually not going to be delegated to let's say usually, but many times it's not going to be delegated to a career official. In fact, it's going to be delegated to these unilateral appointees that don't get Senate confirmation, but tend to be have less skill, have less expertise than either the appointees or the career officials. And I speak of what is called Schedule C appointments or non-career senior executive service that are unilaterally picked by the president or by the administration, and of Senate confirmed versus these unilaterals, we have a lot more unilateral appointments, right? Like about 3,000 or so of unilateral appointments, right? So unless it's going to a career official, are we truly meeting that idea through acting? And I just think that it brings, it shows the nuance in this phenomenon, that it's just not like a turn on, turn off button, which obviously neither of you think, right? But then that complicates the need exactly for reform, right? And I'm wondering now if we could shift a little bit to what your prescriptions might be in terms of reforming the Federal Vacancy Reform Act, right? And also generally as it concerns appointments and the civil service generally. So with that, Anne, I give you the mic.
Reform of the Federal Vacancies Reform Act. I would say First, before talking about legislative reform, I think, Bill, what you talk about and what what you've done in your research, Bill, and what Christina's done in her research also just shows that we need more research to actually answer some of these questions, right? So, Bill, your hunch is that most of these delegations or acting officials are non-career. I don't think we actually know that, right? I'm doing some subsets of positions, and at least in certain positions, say chief financial officers, inspectors general, it is career, but we don't even know, like overall in the vacancies, like who it's going to, and the work is hard. And I'm in a law school, so I'm allowed to do more of this descriptive data gathering work, which is given kind of less value, I think, in political science departments. And Christina not only has to do the fancy theory and the fancy empirics, but in order to do any of that, has to gather all this immense data, which we need to answer any of these questions. So I just want to give a shout out. And Bill, you went to the GAO data, just a shout out to those. And I've been in data too, but like it takes time. And unless it's sometimes tied to a fancy theory, gets undervalued. So in terms of legislative reform, I have some ideas. So
before you jump onto that, if I could just second that point, that like, it would be so amazing, like just across the board to actually know who are filling these positions, like much less even just reform, like status quo, keep status quo as it is, no reform, just having a central database of who is filling positions, when they start, when they end, like where they came from. It's taken me and a team of research assistants an entire year and a half to collect this kind of data that required scouring tons of different sources because there isn't a centralized database, and there should be. So that's my plug to that. Okay, continue.
Just a quick comment from Andy Rudalevich, who's in our audience. He said he wants to give a big amen to Anne's endorsement of the greatness of political science. So I'll amend that a little bit and just let's keep it to the greatness of Christina, Andy. Okay. All right. So with that, Anne, we're going to
reform the Vacancies Act reform. So Katie Porter in the House has an Accountability for Acting Officials Act proposed legislation. And I like much of this act. So what are some of the things that I would do to change the Federal Vacancies Reform Act? Number one, I would shorten the time limits for acting service for those in the highest level positions. Like you shouldn't be able to serve 720 days as an acting cabinet secretary. I'm less worried about the assistant secretary because the assistant secretary, after all, doesn't need to be a Senate confirmed position. So I would definitely shorten the Vacancies Act time limits for the very highest positions. Two, I would change who can actually serve in an acting capacity in these highest positions. So you just need 90 days in the year preceding the vacancy. I would like it to be 5 years or so. So someone like Matthew Whitaker couldn't serve as acting attorney general. And instead, by having a 5-year of a minimum service period from agency workers, you would really then be drawing from the senior career ranks. So getting back to your question, Bill, about who are these actings, that you would draw more from the career ranks as opposed to the political ranks. So that's two. Number three, I would at least in terms of delegations, right? So actings are a workaround to confirmed officials. Delegations are a workaround to acting service. So at the least, I would want transparency in delegations. You think it's hard to figure out who's an official acting? It's even harder to figure out who's been delegated the functions of a position. And in addition to transparency, I would want Congress to think more about what functions of some of these jobs shouldn't be able to be delegated downward. And then a fourth reform, and I have many more, but I'll stop with one that actually would expand actings. And that's, I would allow more actings who have been formally nominated to continue serving as an acting. Right now, under a decision, SW General, and also in the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, it's very hard for someone to be both the nominee and the acting. So actually, when Robert Wilkie, who was acting Secretary of the VA, once he was formally nominated for the job, he had to step down as acting Secretary of the VA because of these limitations. This also happened in the Defense Department with Mark Esper. And it seems that if you're Senate confirmed to another job, it seems that you should be able to be nominated for a more senior job and keep the acting title.
I especially love that last point, because I think that it would do a lot to incentivize both the president and the Senate to do their jobs, right? As it applies to confirmation or nomination and confirmation. So right now, for instance, Biden still at his 400 positions that Biden hasn't even nominated someone for, right? But if he had that incentive that, oh, if I nominate this person, I can at least put them in an acting position, right? Until the Senate can do their job. Or are you saying only if they've been nominated? Okay.
I would only allow that for people who've already been confirmed to a job.
Okay, so confirmed to a lower ranked job.
Yeah.
Okay, I understand. All right, great. But still, it would incentivize the Senate to do its job, right? To speed up the process in terms of confirmation delay.
Yeah, and I'll just say one thing that's kind of circles back to an earlier question you had, Bill, about the role of the Senate. Like, we were focusing on the president and kind of internal agency dynamics. And as you and others have shown, right, the Senate may actually prefer the acting to a nominee, but you also have to think that the Senate, right, has other priorities as well. So you had a Republican majority in the Senate under President Trump. And McConnell, didn't press for nominations on agencies because he wanted to use that limited floor time on judicial nominations, right? So you also have to think about kind of what's competing for that Senate time. And again, though, if we could just get a bunch of these jobs out of Senate confirmation, I think that would, in the end, be the best solution, with somehow giving priority to careerists in filling them.
And to that point, if I just I know we want to talk about Biden, and I have a lot of notes and thoughts on Biden, and it's conjecture is fun, but the question of and this gets back to it's so easy, particularly when you're crafting a law or when you're evaluating things in a historical perspective, to forget that these humans are not non-existent until they suddenly become nominated. In many circumstances, in my interviews, and then also in various departmental memos that I've FOIA'd and various other types of communications, it seems pretty clear that, at least in the past, and perhaps not going forward after the Trump administration, but when people could be nominated for the position to which they would then be serving as an acting, they would really engage in that position, right? And when it shifted after 2017, those individuals who were nominated didn't disappear. They interacted with the acting. Granted, oftentimes it was as the counselor to the secretary or as a someone to the president, but they were not behind some type of thick glass wall and just waiting for the moment when they could walk through the door. And so to think that, they're not interacting with the acting that's sitting in that position, they're not helping to start kind of get things started while they're nominated and waiting confirmation, I think is like a bit of an an oversight on the fact of Congress, and that putting them in there as in that acting capacity could increase the ability for the Senate to, really bring that into the confirmation hearing and say, hey, these are the things you've done as acting. Are you going to continue doing that when you're confirmed? These are the decisions that you've made in the short amount of time that you've been serving without our consent. Maybe we should talk about what you're going to do when you get it. Things like this.
Could I just interject quickly here that, right, we think of appointments as the president nominates, number one, right? I guess, in Christina's awesome theory, right? The president has to choose to nominate or not. But once the president nominates, the subsequent action is the Senate decides to confirm or not. But what actings do is actually allows a bit of a kind of flip in the order right? Because the last step in the theory is like nominate, Senate decides to confirm or not. Once confirmed, person starts. Is by allowing someone to be in acting, you kind of put them in to the position early and then kind of confirm them after. And some states do this, right? The state of California, where some of us are currently located, the governor makes a bunch of appointments, and the California Senate has a year to confirm them. And so the kind of year becomes a bit of a test to whether they should be confirmed.
And so then that might go against your previous point that you'd want people who are actually confirmed into these acting roles.
Very true. But I think that to balance it out, it's with the lawyer in me, the kind of accountability part, that if you've been confirmed to something, I worry less about the accountability part because you've been reviewed at least for another position by elected persons.
Yeah, I suppose that one thing that I would add to the general reform is if there is an acting, I like the 5-year plan, because then it could be an appointee who's been in place, so that would have to stretch over 2 administrations, right? But it's an appointee who's been in place, knows the inner workings of the agency, understands the different parts, and has built a level of expertise to lead, right? But because the calendars are not concentric to one another, right? The political calendar versus the regular calendar versus fiscal calendars kind of they don't necessarily overlap, and so I would actually be more attuned to requiring a career senior executive servant to be in these acting positions just to assure continuity of the organization. One point that I'd like to bring up is we talked about the need for more emerging scholars to study these issues. I would like to give a shout out to Chris Piper, who is a student at Vanderbilt, who has shown that these vacancies can have dramatic impacts on how agencies prioritize different goals and the relative instability of those priorities. It really depends on who is in charge, right? So just a note on him and a shout out to him for his work. So with that,
and I'll just say one thing about restricting to career folks in the acting capacity. The House of Representatives actually passed, in their version of the National Defense Authorization Act, the latest round, they would have restricted acting IGs to career people in the IG's office after kind of what happened at the State Department and Transportation Departments, with Trump kind of turning to political actings. Now, it didn't end up in kind of negotiations with the Senate bill, but it got a bunch of traction, right? So there to sort of actually limit, at least for certain positions, actings to careerists.
Yeah, and one other thing that I'd like to note is that focusing, on congressional oversight, and focusing on whether or not we know who it's being delegated to, all kind of lends itself to this overt emphasis that we've seen to have in our polity, but also as political scientists, on this concept of moral hazard of the actor, as opposed to, again, these ex ante things that we can put in place to ensure that there's not adverse selection, that we seem to ignore, the concept of adverse selection in lieu of, an overt focus on moral hazard. But that's like an inside baseball kind of critique that I'll back off of. So with that, I would like to open it up to more questions from the audience. We only have about 20 minutes left, so I want to make sure that if you're here and you've been paying attention, that if you'd like to pose any questions, particularly to our 2 guests. So I'm not on the spot, but no, only because I'm really valuing their time, and I would like to hear their perspective. So any questions from the audience? I'm going to just plow forward while we're waiting for some questions. So let's talk about Biden, and let's talk about what's happening with Biden currently, right? So I told you, I told the audience here that, we have 400 positions that don't even have nominations yet. If you compare Biden to previous presidencies, the number of nominations he has made is just barely above Trump. And Trump was infamous for not putting nominations forth early in his presidency, or actually throughout his presidency, right? And so does this mean that Biden is pursuing the same types of strategies that Trump or the Trump administration potentially pursued in terms of subdelegation, unilateral appointments, not worry about what the Senate thinks of who's in charge, and just go at it himself? Or is there something else, underlying this? So Anne has unmiked. I'll give it to her first, and then we'll move to Christina.
I think there's some similarities and differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. With regard to differences, if you go to congress.gov and pull up nominations, and of course this includes judicial nominations as well, but there are not that many by this point. As of today, President Trump had 56 nominations formally submitted to the Senate, whereas President Biden has 130. Right, so many more formally submitted. Again, this includes some judicial nomination, includes some of these double nominations, like Linda Thomas Greenfield for the UN rep, but it gives a sense that it's still apples to apples. But President Obama at this point in 2009 had 170. Right. So the Biden administration is somewhere between President Trump and President Obama. I do think, and I wrote
sorry, Anne, I just wanted to amend my statement. I didn't mean he's slightly above in nominations. He's slightly above in confirmations, right? So he's only has like a handful of confirmations above Trump. Is that correct?
Yeah. So with regard to confirmations at this point, according to the Washington Post tracker, Biden has 34, Trump had 25, and Obama 68, though I should say the 25 and 68 numbers are at the 100-day mark, and we're not.
That's true.
We're not quite there. So definitely trailing Obama. And I, for the Center for American Progress in 2010, wrote a report about how slow President Obama was being. So I feel in terms of consistency, I think, wow, we're a little slow here. I would say both on agencies and on courts, right? There are a lot of Article 3 court openings and very few nominations thus far. I do think that President Biden's administration is really using the Vacancies Act in very savvy ways. A lot of first assistants named on January 20th, as I wrote in a short piece for Brookings. And in many of those cases, those first assistants sort of automatically became the acting. And of course, these first assistants are not confirmed, Bill, as you say, right? They're not. They're typically not drawn from the senior career ranks. These are kind of political people that were kind of brought in as first assistants. I guess I'm hopeful that when we hit the 300-day mark in November, that we will see a lot more nominations, that we're not going to see what we saw in the last administration, where positions just never received a single nomination throughout the 4 years, and there was a incredible reliance on delegations. Though on the other hand, if you look at the last 2 years of President Obama's administration, he submitted far fewer agency nominations than his predecessors and relied heavily on actings and on delegations of authority. So it may just be the machinery of government is not working as we might desire. And so actings and delegations are kind of second and third best, but they allow the government to function. And that's better than not having the government function.
Thank you, Anne. And Christina?
I was going to say something very similar, but also I think that, and I think, Anne, you had brought this up in an email. I think that it's really important to recognize is it's not just that Obama had this number and Trump had this number, but Biden has curated an incredibly diverse cabinet and has engaged in really meaningful outreach to specific types of representation that we really haven't seen in top level administrative positions before. And I think that there's, and again, this is going to take some time to bear out. I think that this is where we get into the moment of conjecture, because it's quite possible that, oh, there was a big flash of lightning. It's quite possible that over the course of the next few years, as we look back, we might have there's a massive stream of thunderstorms coming through right now.
We hardly hear. So don't worry.
Good. Okay, so what I was thinking that we might be observing is there's a tendency for one nomination to trip up a steady stream of other nominations. Senators will use that nomination as delay, as a bargaining tactic for other things. And by not giving the Senate those kinds of bargaining chips, the Biden administration right now is almost forcing them to say, I'm going to reject this nominee on something other than something else that I'm hoping to get, right? It has to be about that nominee, which I think, Bill, you pointed to, that this is an incredibly successful set of nominees that have gone through confirmation. They're incredible in terms of their expertise, in terms of their experience, in terms of their ability to bring really important perspectives to their position, and in ways that we just haven't seen. And it's quite possible that the reason why we don't see this huge tidal wave of nominations in lower positions is, one, because, as Anne's basically said, they don't really need a Senate confirmed appointee, but also it could trip up these really important nominations before they've gotten through. And so I just wanted to throw that out there
I think it's important to recognize that, especially to get the really good nominees in charge of these agencies, that they want to bring in some people with them, right? And so they negotiate with the president as well. And something that I don't think has been recognized in terms of lengths of vacancies, particularly at these assistant levels, is the relative lack or how much negotiation is being done between a departing appointee and the administration, how much an administration is planning on it. And so one thing that I might add to a reform is that agencies have formal contingency plans in place for the departure of a given appointee, that this is made public, and we would know potentially it would solve the problem of not knowing who is being subdelegated responsibilities. But at the same time, that these formalized contingency plans would at least give them a playbook to deal with the departure of an unexpected departure.
Yeah, I think I would also add that, right, the Biden administration has come in and said, we want to have political appointments that reflect America. I mean, other presidents have said that, but I feel like this administration has done much better on that front. And because many former appointees do not reflect the diversity of America, it's going to take longer, right? If you've never filled out these long forms that Christina describes before, it's going to take longer for the vetting, and it's going to take longer to get people who have not yet served in government to come in. And it's I think Dave Nixon and other political scientists have talked about how I think it was for women at the FCC took longer, right? The nomination period, the lag was longer for female appointees. And of course, right, just any search model, right? You take longer search costs to get different outcomes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work within public administration that shows that the mobility within federal government agencies is much better for diverse executives and also for women than it is in comparable organizations like Fortune 500 companies, for instance, right? Doesn't mean that it's like perfect there. There's still a lot to go, but you have diversity in these acting ranks amongst the career, and potentially that's being recognized as well. I'd like to move to a question from Drew Flanagan, if you don't mind. He asked if we're aware that Biden has nominated 9 nominees who since inauguration have been acting in the role they were nominated to, parentheses, usually appointed to a lower position and assume the acting role, end parentheses. If so, do you think this tactic, which allows non-confirmed individuals to influence policy, unfairly circumvents the Vacancies Act?
Well, so first of all, just a technical thing is once those nominations are formally submitted to the Senate, those individuals lose the acting title, right? So Chris Schroeder was acting Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. He got to be in that acting role because he was named as the principal deputy assistant attorney general. As soon as his nomination was submitted, he lost the acting title, now just has the principal deputy title, but is carrying out all the functions of that job to which he's nominated through delegation. So there are some concerns with this. I mean, that's why under the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998, we don't allow this kind of dual hatting of acting and nominee. The Senate used to be much more worried about this. They would actually ask in confirmation hearings whether someone had any contact with the agency to which they had been nominated. And the idea was if you had any contact else before confirmation, that was seen as like not legitimate. But of course, these people are there in the acting capacity. So that's permitted until their formal nomination is received. And so I think there are advantages and disadvantages to having people like Chris Schroeder kind of come in as the acting, be nominated, lose the acting title, presumably will be confirmed and will be kind of back in the job. There's sort of, that allows for certain continuity, certain expertise. But of course, there are kind of accountability concerns as well. And of course, as you mentioned, there are, people at the Department of Transportation where this has happened and other agencies as well.
Great. Christina, do you want to add to that, or shall we move on to the next question?
I mean, yeah, that basically, I was going to say the same thing, is that now they lose their acting status. But again, this gets to Anne's point as to, what exactly these people are doing. And if they're all acting but in title, then, that brings up some questions that I think, our previous conversation touched on and talked about. And I think that all reforms going forward really need to think about is really delineating what the duties are, because, saying the non-delegable duties of the position, well, if there isn't anything that's there that says only this position can do this thing, then really the person who's performing the duties is acting just without the acting, official title, which I guess is just really, they're just losing out on something to put on their resume.
So Donna Jean Ward posed a question that she said we answered, but it makes me think a little bit more of the individual agency that people have. And so I'd like to kind of rephrase her question. She asked what the advantages or pros and cons are for these acting appointees. I would like to ask, specifically at an individual level, right? If you're either, and the calculus is going to change depending on whether you were, appointed prior, or if you're a career official. And Christina, you touched on this a little bit, but what desire would one have to be an acting, right? And what does this do for someone? What incentives are there to be acting, and what incentives are there against, or disincentives, I should say, to being an acting official too? And Anne's writing a book about this, so I'm sure she'll be able to give us some anecdotes. But with that, why don't we start with Christina, since Anne went first last time, and then we'll move to Anne.
Sure. I think that, from an individual perspective, there's a few things, right? So first, it as someone who, if we take as an assumption that, these career civil servants are in their position, one, because they find value in their position, because they have expertise that's particularly meaningful, because they've chosen this career path in public service as opposed to the private sector for a specific reason, whether it's job security, impacting policy, because they just really are super enthusiastic about, maintaining the national parks. There's a lot of different reasons why individuals can pursue a career and work their way up through the ranks, right? Because remember, to get to those positions that would then be in an acting capacity, you have been, if you're a careerist, you've been with your respective bureau or department for a considerable amount of time. So you might find value in knowing what it's like to be the boss, what it's like to be in the room, to be in the room where it happened, right? Like to be involved in that decision-making process, even if you're not an active player because you're not a political appointee per se, but to see what the options are available. And perhaps that then opens up to you a career opportunity that you hadn't seen as an option before. Perhaps then, as someone who started out as a GS10 or GS6 and is now all the way up at GS15, or maybe, hopped around to different positions, perhaps now as an acting, they could see, this is actually something that I might want to put my name in for. I might actually want to, submit myself for this kind of thing. And so that's a really big pro for them. And then also on top of that, it provides them with a little bit more perspective when they go back to their own position. It no longer is that there's this, veil of ignorance, curtain of the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak, but rather they've seen what is going on. They've been involved in seen how many different parts have to be moving at the same time. And so perhaps it also provides them with that kind of perspective that allows them to be just a little bit more efficient in their position, in their original position. So I think there's a lot of pros to it from the individual's perspective. So long as, again, you don't end up being associated with that administration in a way that you don't want to be, and then have to exit your deemed career path because of that.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll add something really small to this. I really like the points that Christina just made. So many folks don't realize that acting officials are not paid more for their acting service. You're paid your salary of your original position, right? That may entitle you to be in acting. But what this means actually for senior career people who are acting and who have the chance, right? The political administration may actually want to nominate them, right? But that if they were confirmed to the job, they would actually end up making less than what they make from their senior career ranks in an acting capacity. So when I talked to a couple former acting officials and asked, did you wish and they were also people who had been nominated, well, what were the but didn't get confirmed? Like what was better about acting as opposed to actually being the confirmed person? And all of those individuals mentioned this idea that they would have made less as a confirmed official than retaining the acting title and their senior career job. Now that's minor, but it's kind of an interesting tidbit on all of this.
Yeah, that is an interesting tidbit. I like it. It reminds me of some of the interviews that I did with the higher GS level folks when they were considering whether or not to move up to SES. That they really enjoyed, the protections that they had at the higher GS levels, and they really didn't want to be, held into under some spotlight as an SES. But with that, I just want to thank our guests. I want to thank, first of all, everyone for coming and listening to this conversation. But I'd really most like to thank Dr. O'Connell and Dr. Kinane for their incredible insights on this topic. If you would like any further information about our guests, please reach out to me. I can forward any further questions to them. Well, again, my name is Bill Resh. I'm very thankful as well to the Bedrosian Center for hosting this. So thank you very much to Aubrey Hicks and Ann Johnson and Dr. Jeffrey Jenkins. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Please have a wonderful day. And Christina and Anne, thank you so much for being here.